I normally would begin most of my contributions by welcoming the opportunity to speak on the topic in question, but I must say that on this occasion I am pretty dissatisfied at the behaviour of the Government in scheduling this debate. The Government have allocated 3.5 hours today for deputies to make statements about on board Pleanála. And the reason for my displeasure at this is that back in July earlier this year, the same government allocated just 2.5 hours to debate almost 50 pages of new planning legislation. In July, we had all of the legislation rammed through with little time for debate or scrutiny, and many of the deputies who spoke during that debate on July 7th expressed similar concerns. They described it as a very technical bill which needed more time to be examined. Regardless of the contents of the bill, it is fundamentally very poor governance practice to rush things without debate, without adequate time for oversight. And that's how these mistakes are being made, it's how loopholes are found, and it's how the errors occur, and that's how legal challenges succeed. We are here as legislators. Our fundamental purpose of being here is to design, debate and enact good legislation. Ramming through bills is becoming too much the norm, and government appear to be tactically using the summer recess to avoid scrutiny or debate on certain types of legislation. It happened in 2021 and it happened again in 2022. There are so many problems in our planning system that you would think that scrutiny of even more planning legislation would be high on the agenda to try and tidy up some of the mess that the planning system is in. The housing crisis, for example, is being exacerbated by planning legislation. Developers over the last few years in some cases have had their developments scuppered by planning regulations that made certain developments in certain areas unfeasible. And the planning regulator insisting on high densities for developments in rural areas is one such example. And no one would deny that this is appropriate for city environments where the transport infrastructure is available to accommodate high-density settings, but it's not appropriate in rural or regional Ireland where no such infrastructure exists. And in a number of on-board Pleanála inspectors' reports, the inspector has relied on the proposition that ministerial guidelines impose a minimum density of 35 dwellings per hectare in relation to the edge of town greenfield sites, where no such minimum exists. And this has been described in those reports as higher planning policy, and that of which usurps the statutory standing of the local county development plan. Minister, the current regulator continues to act ultra vires in writing to the county councils to insert as mandatory such non-existent minimum densities. And it has been decided in the courts enough times now that the current regulator is simply wrong on some of the most basic elements of the law. And certainly the advice that he has given to the Minister and the Department have also been wrong. This should by now raise alarm bells. And I expected to see action taken after your department's most recent loss against Cork County Council for the second time, a complete waste of the taxpayers' money. And the fact that we have this particular regulator investigating his former colleagues in on board Pleanála, some of which he may have appointed or advised on their appointments, is a perfect display that all of the millions spent on tribunals and inquiries really have thought as nothing. Now, Minister, if
allegations here, and we're on thin ground in relation to it. You're entitled to raise issues.
The issue I'm raising, Lascian Corley, is that we can't have the regulator investigating people whom he worked with. It makes no sense, and it's not transparent. He has worked with these people. He was the head of planning policy. That's the issue. If I haven't made that clear, that's the issue. Is that okay?
Well, I just ask you to be a little careful in what you're saying. The planning regulator has a job to do.
The planning regulator.
I'm not going to.
He also has.
No,
he also. He has a defined role of which he acts outside of Glasgow.
I'm not going to have an interchange with you. You're entitled to make your contribution uninterrupted, but with me, I'm simply drawing your attention to be careful. That's all in relation to naming people. That's all. Okay. I'm not going to have an interchange with you, but continue.
I'm talking about the actual office of the regulator investigating his colleagues, which clearly is what it is. That's what I'm outlining. It's not appropriate. The fact that we have this particular investigation ongoing is not appropriate. And last Corla, I might take on that interchange if I do take a little bit longer to explain what I'm trying to say. And I think that the Minister is well aware that we would have a situation arise again that will give rise to the transparency of that investigation. I mean, we've heard what Deputy Paul Murphy had to say in all of the people he named. There were 20 at least, and there didn't appear to be an issue. But when we seem to have someone who has been a colleague of all of these people, it may give rise to an issue. It certainly does not instil the public's perception or instil trust and confidence in the planning system, Minister. I believe that's something that you'll be quite aware of yourself. And the premise of the regulator, and this is fact, is that viability is not a planning consideration. And the government's planning policy leaves developers with a choice: build to meet the conditions set down by the regulator, or don't actually build at all. And this meant that developers were not building and have contributed, which has mainly contributed to the lack of housing supply, with the failure of the current minister and the department to recognise the problem. The planning system is a mess, and the system of objections, appeals, judicial reviews, it does need to be streamlined so as not to benefit serial objectors or deprive citizens of a say, but to ensure that the government operate within the law and deliver the much needed housing required. If this is not addressed, our housing supply will not recover to the levels required to solve the problems which currently exist. There are thousands of people now homeless. There are no places for students to live and go to college. The PhD students yesterday said that they are sleeping in tents on the college grounds of Trinity in UCD. Neither are there houses for the immigrant workforce we need to take up the jobs that we can't fill with local workforce, all of which can be traced back to the planning policy of this government and those before. The most recent controversy surrounding On Board Pleanála has damaged trust in On Board Pleanála and the entire system. The Deputy Chair resigned in August, and due to the ongoing investigation into the possible conflicts of interest which went undeclared, I shall refrain from commenting further on the specifics at this time. But regardless of the outcome, this should be the catalyst for reflection on the role of On Board Pleanála and the state of the planning system as a whole. I do hope, Minister, that we do not have to continue spending hundreds of millions of the taxpayers' money on judicial reviews being brought because the department was sitting on its hands and ignoring the basics of the problem. Thank you. That's Councillor.